I miss the Cold War. If you can get over the whole fear of instantaneous nuclear annihilation, it has its advantages. I mean, the world seems so much simpler in the Cold War. I mean, if there's a problem in your life, whether it's a problem in Vietnam or you just stub your toe, you can probably find a way to blame it on the communists and have a significant likelihood of being right. But then the Cold War ends, and history certainly gets a little weird. At least that's what historian Francis Fukuyama thought. Francis Fukuyama is a historian that writes the book The End of History and the Last Man in the year 1992 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And Fukuyama kind of sees the end of the Cold War as a turning point in history. And certainly on that point, he was definitely right. But Fukuyama just says that it's not just any ordinary turning point, that with the end of the Cold War, human civilization is going to dramatically change permanently. And here's his argument. That humanity has reached, quote, not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. The part in me that likes job security is feeling very nervous about this, the whole idea of the end of history. He goes on, that is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So to Fukuyama, everything has been building up to the adoption of Western liberal democratic values. You might remember in the beginning of the year, to bring things back full circle, you had to complete an autobiography, and we talked about different ways to interpret history. And one of those schools of interpretation is called Whig history. That's W-H-I-G, like the political party. And Whig history, remember, takes the view that the story of human civilization is the story of our emergence from barbarism towards progress, towards enlightenment. And this is a school that was particularly popular in Britain, but of course it's influential. And you can kind of think of Fukuyama as being maybe one of the last Whig historians here. But for better or for worse, the Cold War does lead to some major changes, or rather the end of the Cold War leads to some major changes. You see the advance of democracy. There's this process that political scientists called democratization that we see in the late 1980s and 1990s as societies either become democracies or become more democratic in character. But Fukuyama's end of history ends itself on September 11th, 2001. And what we find ourselves in is in a war that's different than the Cold War, but in some respects leads to some of the same basic conflicts and fears and anxieties, the war on terror. And of course, this is where we get into current events, because the war on terror is still ongoing. And because of the nature of the war on terror, there's probably nobody to really negotiate with. It remains to be seen how or when the war on terror will end. But we're not going to talk about the entirety of the war on terror, even though there are of course some other points in the war on terror that are going to be very historically significant later on. For example, the emergence of ISIS or ISIL in Syria and Iraq. That's not really something we're going to focus too terribly much on. Really, the focus is going to be on just one of the terrorist groups that the United States goes to war with in 2001. And of course, that terrorist group has its roots in the Cold War itself. You might remember that in 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. And the logic of the Cold War dictates that if somebody is going to aim a gun at the communists, at the Soviets, they must be our ally. That's what, we kind of thought about the Shah. And that's what we thought about many of the Cold War allies during that time period. And the United States allies itself with this, amorphous group called the Mujahideen. These are basically an organization of Afghan fighters that resist Soviet occupation for over a decade. But they didn't just consist of Afghan fighters, because remember that the invasion of Afghanistan is something that mobilizes the Muslim world, where um, all over the Middle East, you have this call for a religious jihad. Because remember that the Soviet Union is officially an atheist state, and the resistance against the Soviet Union is kind of characterized as kind of a religious struggle. And one of the military commanders in the Mujahideen is this guy, Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden is a very unlikely symbol of terrorism in the 20th and 21st centuries. So to kind of give you an idea of just how absurd bin Laden's story is, just imagine the son of J.P. Morgan or Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller deciding to set aside a promising career in, robber baroning and moving to the UK for the purpose of blowing up Buckingham Palace. Somebody who sets aside a life of privilege and ease, to advance some kind of political goal. And that's basically bin Laden for you. Bin Laden is actually the son of the wealthiest person in Saudi Arabia who is not a member of the royal family. And yet, bin Laden is radicalized, partially because of, I think, Wahhabist religious indoctrination. You don't necessarily need to know that, but just a little bit of context. And also because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, when the Cold War ends, though, the Soviet Union goes from being public enemy number one to, they don't even really rate. Partially because, let's say for the next 10 or so years, the Russian Federation has bigger problems than Afghanistan. The Russian Federation couldn't even invade Chechnya, right? And by the way, Chechnya is part of Russia to begin with. If it just shows you, some of the complexities and difficulties the Russians are going to have over the next 10 years. So just because, we talked about the U.S. sort of developing alliances of convenience, well, for bin Laden, the U.S. was also an ally of convenience. That just because the United States was helping, not bin Laden specifically, but the Mujahideen generally, that did not mean that bin Laden didn't have grievances against the United States. So bin Laden forms an organization called Al-Qaeda, which in Arabic basically is the English equivalent of the cell or the unit. And it's important to realize that even though it is a Sunni theocratic organization that uses terrorist tactics to advance its goals, that it's not a megalomaniacal organization. Like, it's not trying to conquer the world exactly. Like, for example, debatably, ISIS does. That ISIS, when it forms around the year 2014, it tries to conquer large quantities of territory in Iraq or Syria. And that's not really the way bin Laden works. Bin Laden sort of sets up bases of operations in states that are broadly considered failed states. In other words, states without strong central governments, like Sudan and like Afghanistan. So anyway, it's also important to realize that bin Laden's grievances against the United States are fairly specific and to a certain extent idiosyncratic. They're grievances that a lot of people would sort of scratch their heads at. Some of them are fairly predictable. For example, American support of Israel. But again, there were many sort of terrorist organizations that fought against the United States that sort of also rallied around that cause. So Al-Qaeda is not really unique in that respect. What is more unique is that Al-Qaeda sort of criticizes the United States for either aiding or abetting the repression of Muslims throughout the world. By the way, bin Laden doesn't really let's say, mention cases where in the 1990s the U.S. actually intervenes to save Muslims, like in the case of intervening in wars in Yugoslavia, where Serbian forces are committing genocide against Muslim Albanians and Bosnians. But nevertheless, bin Laden sort of mentions the fact that U.S. troops are stationed in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, for those of you who don't know, is the center of basically the holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. I think Jerusalem is kind of in second or third place, depending upon who you talk to. But in other words, the presence of foreign troops on Saudi territory was seen as blasphemous, as unacceptable. But again, you have a whole laundry list of complaints. The fact that the United States had levied sanctions against Iraq, the fact that India was, was alleged to repress Muslims in the region of Kashmir, the fact that Russia was fighting I guess you could say civil war, but more like an internal or secessionist war in Chechnya against mostly Muslim people. So yeah, you kind of see this long laundry list of grievances where bin Laden is blaming the United States for the plight of Muslims around the world, even including things like the partition of East Timor, where East Timor is granted independence in the 90s from Indonesia. And East Timor is a predominantly Catholic sort of province that becomes a country, whereas Indonesia in general is a mostly Muslim country. So I guess what I'm saying here is that a lot of people don't understand sort of bin Laden's motivations, and it's not as if he tried to conceal them. It's just that they're usually very, very specific. So throughout the 1990s, bin Laden launches a series of attacks against U.S. forces and diplomats abroad. In 1998, there is a bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya, pictured here. And top of the screen, you also have the bombing of the USS Cole. And so Al-Qaeda was a known factor in the 90s, and it wasn't uncommon to see bin Laden on the news. It's not as if Osama bin Laden sort of spawned into existence in the year 2000 and 2001. And in fact, the United States had tried to retaliate against some of bin Laden's bases located in, I think, Sudan during the 90s. But he wasn't really our predominant focus. But of course, September 11th changed that. And in fact, nothing could really prepare us, I think, for 9/11. So you go from an attack like this, which is tragic, but still, it's basically an attack where Al-Qaeda forces blow a rather large hole in a U.S. warship, to something like this, where Al-Qaeda simultaneously attacks the political, military, and economic nerve center of the United States. So if you think about it, the World Trade Center represented the strength of the American economy. The Pentagon, which was also hit, and sometimes people forget that, is of course the center of the Defense Department. And of course, we also really, really forget the fact that Al-Qaeda almost destroyed the White House, and in fact may have done so if not for the timely act of self-sacrifice of the passengers of Flight 93 that diverted the aircraft into the hills of Pennsylvania almost at the last possible moment. So, having lived in that time period, Americans knew about bin Laden, but at the same time, nothing could really prepare us for something quite on this scale. Texas Governor George W. Bush was elected President of the United States following the highly contested election in the year 2000. The reason we know it was highly contested, well, when you have a Supreme Court case called Bush versus Gore, in which basically the Supreme Court has to step in and rule on whether or not a recount of ballots cast in the state of Florida is constitutional, that kind of indicates how contested it actually was. So that being said, George W. Bush is, in a lot of respects, a very different president than his father. His father was kind of one of the last remnants of the progressive Republicans of the early 20th century. His father was somebody who was very knowledgeable about foreign policy. George H.W. Bush was the president that helps end the Cold War, is also the president that organizes the coalition that fights the Persian Gulf War. But his son is very different. In some respects, his son symbolizes the importance of the Reagan Revolution in that coalition. He is considered a religious conservative, but at the same time, George W. Bush is also considered a business conservative. So he kind of unites both wings of the party together. Now, that being said, there's one thing that he doesn't really have much interest in or experience in is foreign policy. And remember that in U.S. presidential history, especially before the Cold War, most presidents didn't really have to worry about foreign policy. That was kind of like, a side gig, I suppose. But again, in the 1990s, in this time period of the Pax Americana, the United States had no rivals. There was, other than, a few wars in Yugoslavia or the former Yugoslavia, there were no kind of great, foreign policy crises that the U.S. had to really deal with. But all that changes in 2001, where you have a president who doesn't really know very much about foreign policy, who is forced to focus all his attention on foreign policy. By the way, these are the moments in which President Bush is informed that there has been an attack. This seems to kind of transform his personality. He goes from being kind of this almost Calvin Coolidge-esque, pro-business conservative, to this Wilsonian idealist. That's probably the best way to describe it. Because, just take a look at this.
I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
So at this point, the United States launches a war on terror. Not a war against Al-Qaeda, a war on terror, all terrorists. So just think about this. What does a member of the Irish Republican Army, Osama bin Laden, and a supporter or a member of the KKK all have in common? Well, probably not much. But except for the fact that now they are being targeted in the U.S.-led global war on terror. And by the way, that adjective global is important. So there's a couple things that you should know about this for the AP exam. Probably the most important thing is what the United States does domestically to basically advance or defend national security. You see the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, and that has basically stayed around even though the war on terror in many respects is kind of wound down. And you also see the passage of the Patriot Act. So the Patriot Act, if you do see a question on it, is probably going to be a question that relates to how the United States has passed similar laws to protect national security. And we've seen many instances of that. The Alien and Sedition Acts, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War, and of course, FDR's basically hit FDR deporting or moving, I should say, Japanese Americans during World War II into internment camps. So in almost all the major wars in American history, we see this balance between constitutional rights and liberties and national security. And in most of those instances, the government has usually prioritized national security. And the Patriot Act is kind of an example of that. The Patriot Act gives the Justice Department basically a lot more discretion to investigate individuals suspected of being linked to terrorists, not just being terrorists themselves, but being affiliated with them. So this includes, warrantless wiretapping, for example, detaining people without an immediate trial or hearing in some cases. And something that also kind of emerges during this time period is the profiling of Muslim Americans. So the United States also tries to go after bin Laden. It had tried to do that in the 90s, and it hadn't worked. Basically, it had tried to eliminate bin Laden by launching cruise missile attacks. But instead, the focus is on basically sparing no expense to go after him. It's discovered that bin Laden has bases in Afghanistan that were used to kind of plan and coordinate the attacks. So the United States invades Afghanistan, not really to go after the Afghan government, which had a sort of, frenemy relationship with bin Laden. They allowed him to sort of live and set up shop in the country, but they were also a little leery about, allowing him to do whatever he wanted. But the U.S. invades Afghanistan really just to go get bin Laden. And U.S. forces come very, very close in the Battle of Tora Bora to, killing or capturing bin Laden, but ultimately he gets away and flees into the neighboring country of Pakistan, where he basically stays for the next 10 years. And 10 years is a long time for closure. So even though the Afghan war is more or less a success and, the Al-Qaeda organization is hurt, the fact is that Americans don't have that sense of closure. And there's still this atmosphere of fear and insecurity. Again, is another 9/11 style attack in the works? Well, I think most people probably thought not. But then again, I think that most people didn't see this coming either. So there's also that. So what happens is that over the next 2 years, or really at the end of 2001 and 2002, the Bush administration shifts its approach. In Bush's axis of evil speech, he shifts the goal of fighting organizations like Al-Qaeda to fighting states, in other words, other countries that are seen to support terrorism. And in the axis of evil speech, he names 3 countries, Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. This leads to the Iraq War in 2003. And the justification for the Iraq War is that Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, the architect of the invasion of Kuwait, is trying to acquire weapons of mass destruction. And that he's still salty about his loss in the Persian Gulf War, and he might turn those weapons over to terrorist groups. We know that Saddam Hussein was kind of a control freak. And if he had a nuclear weapon, he was probably going to hold on to it. And we also know that he had a nuclear weapons program, but in the 1980s. And it was basically blown up by Israel. So basically the war, if we're being generous, was either based upon exaggerated evidence or fabricated evidence. But nonetheless, Iraq is toppled. And what that also does, though, is that even though the government of Saddam Hussein is toppled, it basically has the following effect. If you've ever taken a bottle of soda and shaken it for a while and then unscrewed the cap, well, basically Saddam Hussein is the cap. And that once that happens, basically, these long repressed religious conflicts within Iraq bubble or explode onto the surface. So we invade Iraq to basically fight the war on terror. But we end up being in the middle of a religious civil war between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. But in the war on terror, the Bush administration basically announces what's called the Bush Doctrine, in which the United States is going to use preemptive self-defense to go after terrorist groups and organizations. And as we kind of see from the Iraq War, the track record here is a little mixed. So that's the war on terror. And I will see you guys next time.